Tilde. I'm going to expose you to several minutes of poor argumentation from two of Breadtube's starred darlings. I apologise for doing this, but it's sadly necessary for the topic at hand, so enjoy a few minutes of Vorsh and ContraPoints. There will be a time code on screen for you to skip to if you'd just like to get to the part of the video demonstrating why they are both wrong.
Freddie Gray was born in 1989 in the West Baltimore neighborhood Sandtown, Winchester. You can see in this picture of him as a child that he grew up in a dilapidated row house with peeling lead paint. Lead was used as a cheap additive in house paint until Congress banned it in 1978 because it causes serious cognitive damage in children, leading to deficits in attention and increased aggression, which may explain why children poisoned with lead are 7 times more likely to drop out of school and 6 times more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system. But shitty Baltimore slumlords often haven't bothered to comply with a congressional ban on lead paint, and as a result, 93,000 children with lead poisoning have been added to Maryland's lead registry, and in Baltimore, the vast majority of these children are black. Many of these kids were later awarded structured settlements as compensation for permanent brain damage, and Freddie Gray was one of these kids.
The reason why black people disproportionately commit so much crime is in large part because systemic poverty has kept them in positions where criminality is the only way for them to make it out of the hoods they're born into.
I don't think systemic poverty leads to an incentivized to commit sexual assault at the rates that sexual assault is being committed in the black community.
Sure it does. Yeah, 100%. Absolutely. Yeah. Because if you're poor, you're more likely to have a poor upbringing, which means there's more likely to be lead in the paint of your walls, which means it's more likely that you didn't have both parents around to raise you. These are all comorbid with antisocial personality disorder.
Therefore, you commit sexual assault more because you had lead paint in your walls?
Being raised poorly and having brain damage? Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Dude, but I'm saying if you check lead levels in your average rapist, I don't think you're going to find any kind of strong correlation.
Well, I would make you a bet. I don't have any data to back this up, and I doubt anyone does. But if we do a survey of the average white rapist and the average poor black, or poor white rapist and poor black rapist, also, I would be willing to bet that the poor black rapist has a statistically significant difference in the average amount of lead in their blood.
Okay.
Before going into this, I want to put a small disclaimer here. I knew very little about lead exposure by demographics going into this. Lead exposure and its various ills are somewhat known to me by virtue of coming up every so often in the study of biopsychology, albeit rarely. There is of course also the general knowledge of lead exposure is bad for people because of basic historical knowledge regarding the use of lead pipes and history of lead being used in medicine. As to demographics, there's been no real reason to hold any sort of pre-belief going in. There may have very well been differences or not. I can completely imagine circumstances that would cause discrepancies to arise, and others that won't, such as regional demographic differences and regional differences in industry, to name but a couple of variables. So going through the research I found on this in this video is more or less how I found my way through the topic in broad. As to if lead is the thing or part of the thing causing differences in life outcomes, this would actually be great if true. Despite what leftists say about everyone who is not them being evil and wanting people to suffer and die, this is actually not true, and I would prefer people have better life outcomes, because happy, productive, successful people is better than miserable, useless, potentially criminal people. I would much prefer people be happy in their lives and succeed towards their constructive life goals. The lead answer would mean that potentially the entirety, or at least part of the differences in life outcomes between people, could be ameliorated via improvements to laws or regulations regarding the use of lead in industry or the domestic sphere, better enforcement of existing laws or regulations, or simply improvements in the socio-cultural sphere regarding the use of lead in the form of not legal or regulatory change, but better education or simply a more widespread knowledge of the risks of lead exposure and times and places that lead are used. This would only be a good thing should the lead exposure assertion turn out to be true. Starting off on the topic of lead exposure by demographic, we need to consider some important things, and those are the lead answer to differences in life outcomes is a moving target. I use the term life outcomes as a general umbrella term here for things such as socioeconomic status, education outcomes, literacy rates, poverty rates, IQ scores, rates of criminality, etc. It's just useful shorthand that we can add or subtract variables from as we find them and work out if they should be there or not, future research pending. Lead rates are a moving target because 1. Acceptable rates of lead exposure have trended downwards over time. This has the potential to inflate numbers over time because it casts a wider net as time goes on. This is demonstrable because the CDC has repeatedly revised its standards on what they term reference lead exposure numerous times over the last few decades. Update of the blood lead reference value United States 2021 Table 1 demonstrates this nicely. Also, as the CDC's lead poisoning prevention program, a long-standing responsibility and commitment to protect children from lead exposure, indicates, there have been numerous revisions to reference blood lead levels, always trending downwards. These illustrate the changes in what is considered problematic lead exposure. However, there is a better example of how this changing of criteria, the shifting of goalposts over time, creates this net widening effect I mentioned earlier. If these changes are plotted onto a graph, you end up with this image, elevated blood lead level nationwide, as gathered by the CDC. Looking at just the categories of black and white and seeing the disparity is of course shocking to people. However, you then have to notice the different measures being used on various graphs, changing the scale over time. The shifting nature of this target can make data look better or worse than it really is, especially considering the threshold used is 100% arbitrary. There is no safe level of lead exposure in humans according to any health body I have been able to find, including the CDC, WHO, and NHS. Using any measurement above 0 is therefore basically random, although as we will discuss later there is a reason we can't use 0 as the threshold. 2. Usage of lead in environments where people may be exposed to it also trends downwards for a number of reasons. Legislation changes regarding use of materials in industry and domestic places ranging from legal to controlled to banned. This will vary according to your nation and possibly by region within the nation. Natural evolutions or developments in materials and their usages or replacements for materials involving lead. Here I'm thinking of things like lead pipe usage being replaced with copper or plastics. Market changes regarding supply and demand for lead and/or lead derivatives, which will impact the wider market and may encourage manufacturers or suppliers to gravitate towards or away from certain materials, such as lead. Industry changes with regards to acquisition or processing of lead from ores in the mining and processing industries, and any procedural, material, or legal changes that may impact those industries, which will also echo out and impact other businesses that rely on those industries. None of the studies I've looked at attempt to normalize for or even acknowledge these as variables outside of the general downwards trends. This is annoying because it could be important to consider, as it may impact blood lead levels in populations, but we work with what we've got. As to lead is bad for you, this is a non-controversial claim. I'm not going to address it. There is so much information out there with regards to the risk of lead exposure gathered over decades. This is true. Let's move on to the more interesting stuff. Next is the use of lead as an argument. The use of lead as an example of cause of differences in life outcomes is misleading. It confuses the potential of something to be an explanation or part of an explanation as that something being the explanation or part of the explanation. The other major problem with using lead exposure or lead poisoning as the explanation for wide-scale differences in life outcomes is that lead exposure requires trained medical doctors to perform tests and analyze the results of those tests in order to give you an answer. Lead exposure is a medical diagnosis. Anyone who is not a medical doctor and has no access to medical test results or doctor's reports or studies containing data vetted by such sources should not be making a statement or judgment call on whether or not someone or a group of people has lead exposure. This is simply not something that they can know from an objective medical standpoint. Thus, anyone making the claim of lead exposure in an individual or group of people should be treated with extreme skepticism. Using lead as the panacea answer to X demographic has worse life outcomes because lead requires ignorance either by intent or by accident of actual rates of lead exposure by demographic. The CDC has gathered data on this across many demographics, mostly concerning age as time has gone on. But there are also studies that have done this with regard to sex, income, pregnancy, and yes, buried under all of that, race. The CDC found that nationally there was not a significant difference in lead exposure by microgram per deciliter of blood based on race as a variable. This chart, generated using data from Tsoi et al. 2016 and Prickett et al. 1994, using National Health and Nutrition Examination data, which we'll talk more about shortly, demonstrates this. That is to say that nationally, in a widespread sample, it would appear that lead exposure seems to be fairly stably equal across racial lines, with small natural variances which can be chalked up to general statistical noise consistent with large volumes of data. We can also see this again in Update of Blood Lead Reference Value United States 2021, Table 2. This is only concerned with children aged 1 to 5, since they are the category of highest risk with regards to lead exposure for numerous reasons, mostly relating to bodily development. They're still growing, and lower body mass means amounts that would not harm an adult will be highly dangerous to children. This comes from 4 cycles of the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, hereafter called NANES. When you look at the rates by race, again by parts per million, 0.2 to 0.3 parts per million difference is not that significant. It should also be noted this is consistently trending downwards, and downwards at such a rate that even though black children may have 0.2 to 0.3 parts per million more blood lead than white children, this is still less blood lead than white children had as little as 5 years previously. In other words, if lead is the causal factor in anything, you'd expect blacks now to be even in whatever it is you're looking at to whites from 5 years ago using blood lead levels as the only variable. This is not the case. It also makes the assumption that a less than 1 part per million difference actually matters, which it doesn't in this case. Lead is simply not that dangerous. Still bad and dangerous, but not that bad and dangerous, where less than a 1 part per million difference is the difference between fully functioning with 0 problems and permanent brain damage, behavioral problems, learning difficulties, antisocial behavior, or death, for example. In fact, going by the CDC's own standards as laid out in the CDC's Lead Poisoning Prevention Program, a long-standing responsibility and commitment to protect children from lead exposure, noted that, at that time, using data from NANES 2007 to 2011, a blood lead reference value equal to 5 micrograms per deciliter was established to define when a child is exposed to higher levels of lead than 97.5% of the US children in that age range. This has since been revised down on the CDC's webpage Blood Lead Levels in Children, with the new standards as of 2021 being 3.5 micrograms per deciliter being higher than 97.5% of US children. This is the category of most risk. It should be noted here that this is a reference level, not a safe level. There is no safe level for lead exposure in humans. However, the reference level indicates level of concern where intervention becomes necessary. It should also be noted that blood lead levels of a perfect 0 are going to be impossible to achieve, because there are always trace elements within the food chain, and those trace elements will always accumulate in the apex of that food chain, similar to mercury levels in tuna. Tuna being an apex aquatic predator eating trace amounts of mercury in other aquatic animals, it builds up over time. The same happens to humans with regards to lead. Trace amounts of lead will always exist in plants, fungi, animals, etc., and those trace amounts will therefore always end up in humans. The same thing happens to humans with regards to other trace elements like gold. Interesting side note, past studies demonstrated the average human of about 70 kilos would contain a total mass of 0.2 milligrams of gold. If refined, this would give you a cube 0.22 millimeters in size. Very few humans eat gold in their lives, let alone regularly, unless you're the leader of a socialist nation, and yet this trace element still accumulates in the human body. Noting that the CDC is finding 0.78 micrograms per deciliter in Hispanics, 0.79 micrograms per deciliter in white, and 1.07 micrograms per deciliter in black children as of 2016, indicates that all ethnicities are comfortably below category of risk of 3.5 micrograms per deciliter. It will be most interesting to see data from 2016 to present, which if current trends hold would more than likely see black micrograms per deciliter also drop below 1 in regards to lead exposure. So, on a national level, using widespread representative samples over the course of decades, there appears to be very little variance in lead exposure by race in the USA. However, other studies have found that there are differences in lead exposure by race, and that this difference usually leans towards blacks having greater lead exposure. This is where the aforementioned left-wing invested anti-racist types will point and say that this is a smoking gun, proving institutional racist white supremacist systemic bias. However, this is more than likely a simple sampling bias based on the areas being examined. You'll notice that the studies that do find differences based on race are usually highly localized studies, only focusing on small areas. We'll be looking at them in more detail shortly. If we cross-reference this with the CDC data finding no significant differences, in order to balance this out, one would expect there to be areas where lead exposure is higher amongst the white population than the black population. It just seems that the academics who study these things either haven't published anything on those areas because they haven't found them, or because they know exactly what they're doing, and they have a narrative they want to push. Specifically, the black people are institutionally oppressed by a white supremacist society that has redlined them into poverty and environmental toxicity. See the other papers of the author B.M. White. They obviously lean politically left because they have a huge focus on looking for differences in life outcomes of blacks versus whites in their other writings, to the point of admitting in the literature review racial/ethnic differences in childhood blood lead levels among children less than 72 months of age in the United States, a systemic review of the literature, that they disregard a number of studies in their literature review, narrowing it down to only 10. Anyone pointing to this study and using it as a data point would be wrong to do so, because it is just a literature review, not a study, and literature reviewers can and do sometimes add or remove criteria for allowing or disallowing studies into their review to help doctor the conclusion of said review. I have no reason to believe that this is not happening here as well. Anyone admitting to disregarding data points in a review of data should immediately be looked at with skepticism. As to the claims regarding rates of lead exposure in criminals, this is a claim, while intuitively correct since it's repeatedly demonstrated that lead exposure leads to worse life outcomes, and worse life outcomes correlate well with increased rates of criminality. There seems to actually be very little solid peer-reviewed evidence backing this assertion. Indeed, in my attempts to locate papers on this topic of lead confirmed to be in people with criminal pasts at a higher rate than non-criminals, I could only find a few papers on this. 1. Bone lead levels in adjudicated delinquents, a case control study, which is dealing only with adolescent offenders in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. This paper itself notes that no data exists as to whether lead exposure is higher in arrested delinquents. The goal of this study is to evaluate the association between lead exposure, as reflected in bone lead levels, and adjudicated delinquency. The paper finds that it is true that there is a higher concentration of lead exposure in delinquent populations, which intuitively we would expect. However, they note that when accounting for variables, one of which is race, there was no noticeable difference in exposure, stating, "Cases had significantly higher mean concentrations of lead in their bones than controls. This was true for both whites and African Americans." That is to say that if lead exposure causes criminality in black people, it should also cause criminality in white people, and that this should be at a similar rate, because this study suggests similar exposure rates, correlating nicely with the CDC data, finding no meaningful differences between race and lead exposure, albeit in this study on a much more localized level. This calls into question the assertion of lead exposure-induced brain damage being the cause of or excuse for higher rates of black criminality, especially since, as the methodology notes, covariates entered into the model were race, parent education and occupation, presence of two parental figures in the home, number of children in the home, and neighborhood crime rate. Separate regression analyses were also conducted after stratification on race. After all this, the researchers found that lead was disproportionately found in delinquent youths, but none of the other variables, race, parent education, occupation, etc., interacted with the lead exposure in such a manner that they felt a need to mention. Another paper, aggregate level lead exposure, gun violence, homicide, and rape did find lead exposure correlates with crime in a way that amused me given the opening argumentation videos, specifically with regards to lead exposure causing brain damage causing rape made by Vorsh.
I don't think systemic poverty leads to an incentivized to commit sexual assault at the rates that sexual assault is being committed in the Black community.
Like, sure it does. Yeah, 100%. Absolutely. Yeah. Because if you're poor, you're more likely to have a poor upbringing, which means there's more likely to be lead in the paint of your walls, which means it's more likely that you didn't have both parents around to raise you. These are all comorbid with antisocial personality disorder.
Therefore, you commit sexual assault more because you had lead paint in your walls.
Being raised poorly and having brain damage. Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
But I'm saying if you check lead levels in like your average rapist, I don't think you're going to find any kind of strong correlation.
Well, I would make you a bet. I don't have any data to back this up, and I doubt anyone does. But if we took a survey of the average white rapist and the average poor black, or like poor white rapist and poor black rapist, I would be willing to bet that the poor black rapist has a statistically significant difference in the average amount of lead in their blood.
Okay.
This study states, with the exception of rape, aggregate blood lead levels were statistically significant predictors of violent crime at the census tract level. However, it should be noted that other crimes only measured 0.02 higher on the measurement scale than rape. Still something of note, but not the 100% slam dunk huge difference you would expect. It should also go without saying with regards to the beginning clip asserting differences in lead rate between black and white rapists, there is no evidence that supports this in any of the studies located on this topic. Anytime they have mentioned this, the levels are, consistent with national averages, found to be similar. This is not to say it's definitely not true, or that there isn't one or two studies out there that may have found that. It's just saying that I haven't located them, and none of the studies I've looked at regarding rape by race and lead exposure have found anything they've felt need to comment on. As an aside at this point, I would like to say to Vorsh, I will take that bet money of yours. I know you'll never pay it because you refuse to even pay your own employees a fair wage for their labour, so there's no way in hell you'll pay anything to someone who is actively proving you wrong using peer-reviewed data. Another study I've located, however, reveals something interesting. The previous year, the same researcher of the aforementioned study looked at the same topic, crime and lead exposure, this time in St. Louis, Missouri. This time, however, they noted some evidence of a negative interaction emerged, however it failed to reach traditional levels of statistical significance. Supplementary models, however, revealed a similar negative interaction that was significant. Using supplementary models to later acquire your 0.02 difference sounds remarkably like we didn't get the results we wanted the first time because we found nothing statistically significant and had to change methodology to get something we can use to back up our pre-established conclusion. It should also be noted again and explicitly stated that these two studies carried out by the similar teams using some of the same researchers constantly recalibrating their methods to be able to state a 0.02 difference is meaningful, found this only in two small localized locations. This stands in opposition to overwhelming data from the CDC. This is somewhat informed by another study, Association of Childhood Blood Lead Levels with Criminal Offending, which found that, quote, overall associations between BLL, blood lead levels, and conviction outcomes were weak. The estimated effect of blood lead level was lower for recidivism than for single convictions, and lower for violent offending than for non-violent offending. This is interesting as it implies that blood lead levels are higher in one-off crimes and higher in non-violent crimes. This is the opposite of what one would expect if blood lead levels caused criminality. If blood lead levels were causing crime, you would logically expect higher blood lead levels in career criminals and higher blood lead levels in violent crime as a result of blood lead levels negatively impacting behaviors such as impulse control. The conclusion states this study overcomes past limitations of studies of blood lead level and crime by studying the association in a place and time where the correlation was not confounded by childhood socioeconomic status. Findings failed to support a dose-response association between blood lead level and consequential criminal offending. In other words, removing socioeconomic variance, so focusing on just lead as a modulator, it turns out lead is a very poor indicator of criminality. There have been other studies on the general correlation between lead exposure and crime while mentioning race as a variable. This is where things may get controversial and upsetting for some people. Feigenbaum and Muller, 2016, Lead Exposure and Violent Crime in the Early 20th Century, used data from 545 cities and found that the use of lead pipes in the 1880s predicted homicide rates in the years 1921 to 1936. The paper found that a city using lead pipes and its distance from a lead refinery were both positively related to its homicide rate, even after controlling for home ownership rates, percentage black population, sex and age demographics, latitude, longitude, and population density. Percentage black population was also a significant predictor even when lead and other covariates held constant. That is to say that percentage black population predicted homicide rates even if you controlled for lead exposure. Nevin, 2007, Understanding International Crime Trends, The Legacy of Preschool Lead Exposure. Somewhat less relevant because this is international and we're mostly concerned with the US in this video, but still worth mentioning. Nevin found that the percentage of the population with lead poisoning was a significant predictor. Lead poisoning explained 14% of the variance in murder rates. However, the percentage of a city which was black was found to be a stronger predictor, and when it was controlled for, lead poisoning no longer had a significant association with a city's murder rate. Once again, this is a study that seems to indicate that if you want to predict murder rate in a city, using the percentage black population is better than using the percentage lead poisoning rates. Although an interesting thing Nevin 2007 did find was that in some areas, blacks were up to 4 to 6 times more likely to suffer lead poisoning than whites, in parts of the 1980s through to 1990s. This marries up quite nicely with what we've seen before. General national trends indicate not much difference in rates of lead exposure, but when zooming into very specific areas, you can find wide variance. Given what we've seen thus far, even though lead exposure does impact crime rate, it appears that there is not sufficient enough difference by race in lead exposure to explain differences in life outcome by race using lead exposure as the variable. I'm unsure what to make of this in totality as a final position, but a few things seem clear. It seems clear that some researchers, namely the 2 sequential papers by Bootwell et al., are aimed at proving an outcome, as can be seen by taking data that finds nothing statistically significant, and then using other models to massage the data into something that can be claimed to be positive or negative. It is important to note that this research is carried out in America, a nation that is very politically polarized around the topic of race, and a nation that has a good track record of borderline pseudoscientific activism in the objectively demonstrably left-wing biased academic profession, as I've covered numerous times before. The study finding a very weak to non-existent correlation between lead exposure and crime was taken from New Zealand, a nation that has its own controversies around the topic of race, but not seemingly to the degree that America has. This may explain the difference in attitude between the researching academics, one saying, "We found nothing, oh well, that's life," and the other saying, "We found nothing, we need to find something, change the model until we find the difference we need." Studies looking at blood lead exposure and finding racial differences either engage in overt or covert data and model manipulation to find a difference by race, or appear to find racial differences in lead exposure by simple incidents of sampling bias based on where or when their sample is taken in the few hundred or fewer people they measure. Hence why larger national surveys with millions of responses over a number of years, such as the CDC's National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey information, find no significant differences in lead exposure by race. As an addendum added into this script after recording, because it's seemingly impossible to ever actually fully finish a video before you find more interesting information to add, I would also like to submit for your consideration a meta-analysis. Should you find yourself thinking I'm being unfair in my criticism of the field of study of lead exposure as related to crime, when I say that I think certain studies have overstated the impact that lead has to the point that they may very well be intentionally recalibrating instruments so as to find something where there is nothing. This meta-analysis from Glasgow University actually supports my position rather well, which I find somewhat validating as I discovered this study after finishing the script and recording it. Somewhat fortuitous, I would suggest. The lead crime hypothesis, a meta-analysis by Higney et al. 2021, performed the first meta-analysis of the effect of lead on crime by pooling 529 estimates from 24 studies. They found evidence of publication bias across a range of tests. The publication bias means that the effect of lead is overstated in the literature. They performed over 1 million meta-regression specifications controlling for bias and condition on observable between-study heterogeneity, which just means differences in data between studies. After controlling for poor study methodology and focusing on only high-quality studies that address endogeneity, the estimated mean effect size is close to 0. Addressing endogeneity just means prefix endo meaning within, like an endoskeleton, geneity as in genesis, the origin of, out of, product of, etc. Endogenous variables in studies just means the variable or change arises from something within the study as opposed to exogenous, and exogeneity meaning the variable or change comes from without or outside the model. Without turning this video into a statistics and mathematics lecture, endogeneity is not good within regression models because it means you've found correlation between your explanatory variable to the error term of your data. The long and short of it is that doing this is bad because it violates one of the classical assumptions of ordinary least square linear regression, which is the model being used. Basically, it ends up meaning you're not proving what you think you're proving, and means you need to go back and do it again because your model and data are faulty. Back to the meta-analysis. When we use the full sample, the mean effect size is a partial correlation coefficient of 0.11, over 10 times larger than the high-quality sample. We calculate a plausible elasticity range of 0.22 to 0.02 for the full sample, and 0.03 to 0.00 for the high-quality sample. Back-of-envelope calculations suggest that the fall in lead over recent decades is responsible for between 36 and 0% of the fall in homicide in the US. Our results suggest lead does not explain the majority of the large fall in crime observed in some countries, and additional explanations are needed. In short, this meta-analysis finds that lead is a very poor indication of criminality, and many studies looking at it use poor methodology, including the Bootwell papers mentioned in this write-up, which are specifically mentioned for poor methodology in this meta-analysis. This results in a wide spread of potential indications, what this analysis terms the elasticity range. It would appear that studies finding correlation between lead and crime rely on this elasticity to claim there is correlation or causation, when there would appear to be none, or at most very little. I find this meta-analysis quite compelling because of the sheer size of the sample of studies used. I also find it quite interesting that my own more limited analysis of papers within the field of lead and crime aligns fairly strongly with a meta-analysis that I found after drawing my conclusions from my own analysis of the studies and some of their raw data. I was quite open to the possibility that my interpretation of this may have been incorrect because of the limited number of studies I was able to find. After all, I'm not a specialist in this field, and there are always going to be journals and other publications that are not listed in aggregator search engines, or may simply be highly specialized and thus only known to a handful of researchers worldwide. And there's also the limited time in analyzing the data and findings. This is, after all, not a full-time endeavor for me. However, finding a peer-reviewed meta-analysis that conforms to my own findings on this field is very heartening indeed, and seems to indicate that my findings, interpretations, and conclusions are certainly valid and seemingly correct. In conclusion, it is not controversial to suggest that lead exposure has a variety of health problems associated with it, and that high levels of lead exposure can cause negative health or life outcomes. However, Lead exposure as a cause of racial differences in life outcomes, especially crime, appears to be overstated by an ideologically biased group using questionable, possibly massaged data, looking to justify or excuse racial differences in life outcomes in such a way as to be able to justify blaming a nebulous system, and then use this over-selected data to demand mass social reform under the battle cry of blaming systemic racism, systemic bias, or white supremacy. People citing one-off small-scale studies that do find differences in blood lead levels by race are almost certainly using cherry-picked information from sample-biased studies that are outwardly contradicted by larger-scale, longer-term, more representative studies. Referencing ContraPoint's video talking about the Freddie Gray incident, in which he cites lead paint in a picture with zero actual proof that that damaged wall contains lead paint, he goes on to mention Baltimore, and how most people in Baltimore who had symptoms of lead exposure were black. Looking up demographics of Baltimore by race reveals that 62.4% of the population is black, 30.5% white, 27.5% non-Hispanic white, 5.3% Hispanic, and 2.6% Asian. In a city where the demographic of black is overrepresented at 62% of the population when compared to the around 13% of the general population, what a surprise, black people are also overrepresented in rates of lead exposure. When you hide the area demographics, mentioning a usually minority ethnic group being overrepresented in something bad makes it sound a lot worse than if you admit that that minority ethnicity is actually the majority in that area, then also forming the majority of people exposed to the bad thing. You can see the manipulation here. This is why on topics such as this we prefer to use data, rather than wishy-washy anecdotes and generalized nothings. You'll find the data to be far more reliable and representative of reality. Unfortunately, that doesn't stop people being suckered in by a corporate and government-supported and funded mouthpiece, using neon lights and interesting costumes to turn off people's brains in order to bamboozle them into believing outright falsities. All this taken together seems to indicate that blood lead levels are of more or less equal concern across racial lines in the US. However, there may be localized areas that display marked difference. However, with no further specific data available on those locations, because it isn't included in the studies for reasons of subject privacy and safety, I can only really suggest dealing with the issue of lead exposure in the relatively weaselly vague politician speak of localized targeted strategies may work better in certain circumstances than large-scale blanket national ones. The major point here comes down to, what are you going to believe is a better representation of reality? Small-scale, highly localized studies carried out by seemingly biased academics recalibrating their measurements to find a predetermined outcome in samples of a couple of hundred or fewer people over the course of a month, or longitudinal studies using representative samples of millions carried out across the entirety of a nation over the course of decades. One of these is far more likely to reveal the state of populations than the other. The data in reality when using large-scale, nationally representative samples shows minimal differences in lead exposure, often not statistically significant, with fewer than 3% of people even experiencing blood lead levels of concern, and those people who do have blood lead levels of concern being seemingly fairly equally represented across racial lines, with a very slight less than 1%, sometimes less than 0.1% bias towards a higher number of black people with lead exposure. If this is proof of institutional oppression or disadvantage, then institutions objectively suck at oppressing and disadvantaging black people.